Hi there. On this CNBC Africa Special, we take a look back at some of the key conversations we've had here in East Africa, from the African Continental Free Trade Agreement to harnessing the opportunities of a green economy. But first, with only 12 countries as of November 2018 out of the 22 required to ratify the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement in order to make it come to effect, having done so, should there be concern over the pace at which African countries that signed the deal are taking to ratify it? We did have a very engaging conversation on this particular matter with top officials who actually did help us separate the myths and the facts on the road to the full implementation of the deal signed here in Rwanda in March 2018. Let's take a look at that. My name is Eugene Adangwe. From March 2018, the agreement was signed historically right here in Rwanda. And of course, a lot of people have been following closely. 49 countries so far have actually put pen to paper to the agreement. And of course, only 12 out of the needed 22 African countries have ratified this particular agreement. I want to start with you, Luke, because of course we know the magnitude of corruption when it comes to trade matters. But before we get deeper into corruption matters, let's talk about your thoughts as far as the speed that has been taken to get to where we are today. 49 countries signing out of 55, 12 ratifying between March and today. What is your thought? What is your take on that speed that has been taken to get here?
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I think Africa leaders are realizing that there is really a need for free trade to be enhanced. Unlike in the past when people were doing things at the individual trade levels. Yeah, I think that is what made them. The other thing again is that there is a realization that development can only come through integration, particularly of the trade. That's what I can say why there is such a speed, even though it's still a concern why some member states of the continent have not yet come on board.
Right.
Yes.
And we'll be taking some time to talk about that.
That's a question perhaps that we need also
to tackle.
Interrogate
in the program. Patience, as Trademark East Africa, your role majorly has always been to facilitate trade across East Africa. Now we're talking continental-wise, Africa. Let me read your thoughts as well. And the same question that I asked Noah here about the speed, the pace. Looking at those numbers that we have today, do you see us achieving that aspired dream of the vision bearers of this African Continental Free Trade Agreement?
EAC has a lot to teach the rest of Africa, the rest of the continent. Lessons that what we've learned in facilitating trade in East Africa is that people understand that there's an incentive in looking at the wider market. So instead of looking at Rwanda with 12 million people, I could produce for 160 people within EAC. And now we're talking about 1.2 billion people in Africa. There's no doubt that there are benefits to it. But I think one of the key takeouts that we had from this conference was that even as we're talking about ratification, we have 49 governments that signed, we have 12 that have ratified, but then we have to go beyond that and think, after ratification, how do we actually start to implement? We have to be thinking, what action plan do we have in place? But in terms of benefits, I think everyone recognizes this. There was a talk about a survey that was done by residents in Africa. And what came out of that is that most of the Africans, at least 60%, recognize that the CFTA is a good thing for Africa. Right. So that's a good starting point. The business people see the benefits in it. The people see the benefits in it. Do the government see the benefits? I think that's the biggest question. A big question mark
from Noah, taking also the same president and also asking a good question, which we'll also interrogate. Let me just bring in Luke now. Luke, from where you sit, a lot has been said at that meeting that took place here in Rwanda concerning the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. And most people have been asking, the business leaders who have been meeting in that particular conference, what more can they do? Because the implementation only happens when 22 out of the countries that signed ratify this deal. So if they don't, then the implementation might not take place. So what more would you have done? Or what more were you targeting to do?
When we should not be too fixated. 12 countries as of date have ratified. You're not counting the processes that are still in progress. And we know that there are at least 15 to 18 ongoing ratification processes. Different parliaments work at different speeds, have different requirements, etc. So you should not expect that all the ratifications will come in at the same time. They will be staggered because of all these different processes. But as I said, we know that there are about 15 to 18 active ones. So if you add, even if you add 15 to 12, you have 27, so you're over the line. But, don't forget that this was a deal that was negotiated among African governments. They sent their people, they sent their trade experts to negotiate this deal. So it only follows that having negotiated it, they will, follow through on the next step, which is to ratify it. But that will take time, and it's not unusual in trade, for trade agreements, for there to be a bit of time, a year, 18 months, to be ratified, for the ratification to take place. So I am confident that this is going to happen. It's going to happen, as Patience just said, that survey, we know it was not a scientific survey, but 36 African countries participated, and the vast majority were in favor of this deal. There's momentum behind this deal, and it's going to happen.
Let me just speak from what Patience asked. The business community is saying that we want this thing. It's good for us. We have the commitment to actually follow through this. But the question that she asked, which I want to pose back to you before I take the microphone away from you for now, is the place of governments in actually ensuring that this is implemented. And talk to me about your perspective from where you sit. When you read the mood, when you read the commitment levels, do you see it there? Is it sufficient enough to take us home?
Yes, I think, of course, each country is different, and they, if you like, the political economy set up and all that. But nonetheless, my sense is that governments want to make sure that they benefit from this deal. And they want to make sure that as these markets are being opened, that they're doing their part, the infrastructure, the cross-border facilities, the support to the businesses, especially the SMEs. So there's a lot that is happening at the same time. But all this would not be happening, and with the intensity and the commitment, without the dynamic. And the dynamic is the trade deal, because the trade deal focuses everybody's attention that we need to move quickly to benefit from this thing. So it focuses attention. Everybody is talking about reforms, about improving border crossings, about infrastructure. I mean, now you cannot open an African newspaper without seeing these issues coming up. And it all has to do with that things have to be done differently now on this continent. And just my last point on this, the pressure on the governments, the demographics, the young population, finding them jobs, every president is facing that pressure. And they understand that it won't happen just by doing what has been done in the past, that new approaches have to be tried. And partners are saying the same. They're telling us that, look, our development assistance is a catalyst. What will do it is trade and investment. And this is what everybody has seen other places in the world. So I think it's very clear. It's no longer rocket science. We all understand, and governments, I think, are moving in that direction.
We've had the dynamics that are involved here. We are talking about people saying we want this and we want it now. But trade experts will tell you trade deals are not negotiated in that sense. It takes time, and which is understandable. We need to actually take time. But the other dynamic is that we're dealing with many other players here. We're talking about 55 African countries if everybody is to come on board, and all of them having different contextual issues within their own uniqueness in their countries. How do you see those coining, those working around the clock to make this deal work? What sort of headache do you think they're having, and how do you think, what sort of painkiller would you be recommending for them to actually handle these dynamic issues that are really, really complex?
Somehow complex. It's not something that has to be done overnight, as you correctly put it. That the momentum has already been realized, but it is a process. As correctly said, that you know, there are different rules that have to be followed by different countries, because the rules are not yet harmonized. As a result, they have to work on this again, so that they will be able to find a common platform. And before they do that, they also look at what are the benefits. Each country is trying to look at what are the benefits that it will achieve from that. Because the concern, as it was said, is more about you know, majority of the youth especially unemployed, and the things cannot remain the same. We have to become innovative and come up with some policies or rules that are really facilitate the process of free trade integrations without hiccups, and also to make sure that cheating is not part of the process.
Right.
Because the moment it's allowed to become part of the process, I think we may not achieve the benefits that we expect to achieve from this good idea of free trade.
How would you define that cheating in your own perspective?
Definitely, that is corruption. That is corruption.
Right.
And you know, this issue of corruption is a cross-cutting issue. It's a cross-cutting issue, and it has to be dealt with in the first place, because it is actually a governance issue.
Right.
You know, any rules that you are putting in place, any policy that you are developing, or even a convention that you are developing, the first consideration should be to close the loopholes that may make it possible for corruption to penetrate.
Right.
As a result of that, that should be the first step that the leaders needed to take into consideration and take very seriously as they are developing the rules that will facilitate the smooth trade, free trade integration system.
Right. Patience, in the beginning of this conversation, you did say that the continent has a lot to learn from the East African region as far as integration is concerned. From those components of complexity that I just mentioned when I was asking Noah that particular question, what do you think the continent can learn as it integrates with itself from the East African community?
We should not undermine the complexity that comes with the multiplicity of trade agreements that already, or RECs that already exist within the region. One of the things that we learned is that, you know, if you're operating in a RECs that already has countries that belong to different trade agreements, if I could call them that, it becomes really, really complex to implement the next phase that you're talking about. Specifically here, if you look at EAC, you're talking about some countries belonging to at least 3. You have some that belong to SADC, they belong to EAC, they belong to COMESA. So making sure that all these trade agreements are actually aligned and that their implementation is coordinated is where the complexity comes. So now we're going beyond the COMESA, we're going beyond the TFTA that was being negotiated between COMESA, EAC, and SADC, and now we're talking about the CFTA. We can't undermine the challenges that will come with implementation of that. And that's why it's very important that we start thinking about the action plan for implementation. The other thing is that we have to keep in mind that while we're talking about regional integration and signing all these wonderful free trade areas, agreements, the motive behind that should be about production. We shouldn't forget that the reason we're doing this is to expand the markets and expand markets for the people who should be having the capital, which is the business people. So the business people should be the people who are chasing this agenda. So it's wonderful that we're talking about governments ratifying and all that, but it's actually supposed to be the businesses that are pushing for it, because businesses need to be more productive, they need bigger markets, they need to be able to source their raw materials, so they need to be the drivers for this agenda.
Are you seeing that happening, or is this something that is still a vision, is still a hope that businesses will actually push for the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement?
I think it's something that is picking up, and it's encouraging to see the conversation that's happening, because the conversation right now is about industrializing Africa. If we want to industrialize Africa, we need to also be looking at it as how will regional integration, how is the integration of Africa going to help to industrialize? So the two need to be linked. We shouldn't forget that one is driving the other. So industrialization is driving the integration agenda. So that's very important. The other thing that we shouldn't undermine is the actual challenges on the ground. Africa right now is one of the most, I'm trying to find a right word for it, but it's
a
not
diplomatic word.
It's not the most wonderfully connected continent. We have challenges moving from point X to Y. So we have major infrastructure challenges. These are challenges that even in EAC, as small as it is compared to Africa, we're still grappling with. We're still grappling with the challenge that most of our countries are landlocked. How do we connect them to the seas without the ones that are not landlocked, the ones that have access to the sea feeling challenged? You know, how do we really open up our continent? That's the kind of conversation that we need to be having. How do we utilize water within the continent? Right now, water transport is really underexploited within Africa. Air is a problem. You know, we are the least contributors to air transportation globally. So how do we liberalize the airspace? So we have to have this conversation on a daily basis beyond just ratification of the CFTA.
Great. I like that, because what it does for us, Luke, is that it makes those who thought that things look so easy, it makes it now look like, we still have a long way to go.
I think Patience has raised a number of issues. If you take the last one she raised about air transport, then she talked about connectivity, she talked about production capacity, and she talked about multiple trade agreements. Let's unpick each of them, because a lot is already happening. On air transport, the African Union has this African single air market deal that was also signed last year.
But it's still stuck somewhere.
It's beginning to unfold. You know, you have to start somewhere. You know, the first step is to bring everybody together to say they agree to a deal. And then you begin to look to see how to take, take advantage of what has been agreed. So it's not really stuck as such. I'm beginning to read that all sorts of alliances are coming up, that flexibilities are being introduced as to which airline can pick up passengers where and deposit them where. You know, all sorts of things are beginning to happen under these deals, but it's going to take time for it to emerge, but these things are beginning to happen. So the problem was identified, a solution has been found, and the industry is now beginning to use that. Take the other one that you mentioned, connectivity, including on the utilization of the inland waterways, the infrastructure, etc. Now, for you to be able to exploit to put in the infrastructure and exploit the inland waterways, etc., there must be a trade sense to doing that. You cannot build a bridge to nowhere. You know, somebody has to use it, and so on. So as you're opening up the market, the governments are seeing the need to put in the investment where it needs to be put to expand the market. So, so it all is going together. It's not, these are not things that are going to happen in a flash, but it is, Take the productive capacity issue that Patience also raised. One of the things that happens when you open up your market is that you're now inviting your entrepreneurs, your businesses, to grow and to scale up. Let me just give you one example. If Ethiopian Airlines was operating in the Ethiopian market. It will be a tiny internal, but because it's able to operate across the continent, it's become a global player. So your firms can only grow insofar as your market allows them to grow. So that the issue of productivity, production, I think what we're seeing is a response which is beginning to happen. I was in the Simba supermarket yesterday, and I was looking at where the products are coming from. A lot of the products that I saw on the shelves are from within East Africa, from Kenya, from Uganda, from Tanzania, different products, your daily household products. And also, I was looking at the prices. Those are much cheaper than the equivalents coming from outside. Let me give you one example. I bought some Cousson soap from Kenya, and I look at Fa from France. The price, the substantial price difference. So we're beginning to see in the consumption patterns, etc., which means that the production is beginning to respond to these. But Patience, the last point, Patience raised the issue of these multiple trade agreements. And actually, for us at the EAC, our thinking is that if you have a continental free trade area, really there isn't space for other free trade areas. I think it was Paulo also talked about the need for common rules, no cheating, no duplicating, etc. Our thinking is that the other free trade areas will collapse. Yeah, and the RECs, which are behind them, can go into deeper integration, and this is also happening. That's why I'm saying we're not starting from scratch. East Africa community is a customs area, which is a deeper liberalization than what we would have continent-wide. And not only in terms of trade, but also sectoral coordination, sectoral policies, etc., for East Africans as part of that community. So you could see the same for SADC, you could say the same for COMESA, for ECOWAS, that there's scope for them to go deeper in addressing these sorts of issues, the productive capacity issues, connectivity issues. So there's a role for the RECs. But in terms of a level playing field throughout the continent on trade, quite frankly, for me as someone, as an economist working in this area, I don't see the scope. And actually, we have, our own analysis shows that tripartite is dead. There is no rhyme or reason for tripartite with the AFCFTA. And I think that some countries are beginning to realize this. There have only been 4 ratifications of tripartite so far. They need 14 to enter into force. And they have taken 2 years to get to 4 ratifications. The AFCFTA has taken 8 months to get to 12 ratifications. So that could also tell you what is going on here, that the countries themselves are realizing that they need to stop this duplication and have a common approach. And that's what's really going to help to liberalize and open up the trade in a much more predictable way and avoiding the confusion that Patience mentioned.
I don't know what Patience thinks on this when probably you hear that probably in the near future the East African community would have to probably be collapsed so that we don't duplicate COMESA, for example, and any other regional blocks that we've always seen out there. Some people would be like, yes.
East African community does not have to be collapsed. It will grow. It will grow in other directions. Other than just trade liberalization. There are many, many other things, good things that are already happening in the East African community that can be scaled up, and that does give it a role, including as a question
your point. Which ones do you think would need to maybe just lose way to avoid duplication?
Couple of quick examples. Yeah. Trade liberalization is essentially about liberalizing the tariffs. But you also have non-tariff barriers. You have issues relating to standards, etc. Those are best dealt with locally. Locally meaning on the ground. So, that alone is a huge scope of work for any regional economic community like the EAC. And the second example, I mentioned, common sectoral policies on agriculture, on industry, on infrastructure, and so on. These are best tackled not at a continent-wide level, but closer to the ground, because these are the solutions are best found at that level.
So as we're thinking about the ratification of the CFTA, are we looking at these negotiations actually happening at a country level, or is it going to be at a REX level, if we're going to do it effectively? Because if we're talking about a CFTA that's going to come and to some extent dismantle the REX, how do we then use or leverage these REX to negotiate for the CFTA?
No, the CFTA was negotiated by countries. This was the member states of the African Union negotiated the CFTA. This was what they agreed, and that's the approach that they used. It's not about dismantling the REX. Nobody's talking about dismantling the REX. As I said, there's a lot of work for the REX which you cannot do efficiently at the continental level. What you can do at the continental level is to have common rules on trade, to say that on this continent, this is how we are going to trade. This is where will be our tariff levels. This is what will common rules on services that you can do continent-wide. But beyond that, you just have to go closer to the ground. And this is where there is a role for the REX. I've not heard anyone talk about dismantling the REX. And in fact, now is looking at how what the REX have been doing so well can be scaled up. I mean, you are working for Trademark. A lot of what you are doing cannot be done at continental level. It has to be done at border crossings, the reforms, the infrastructure, the procedures, the processes. These have to be done on the ground.
Now, small and medium enterprises account for a good 77% of all jobs in Africa. With over 54 million jobs needed on the continent by 2020, Africa needs to strongly support entrepreneurs, create an enabling environment, and educate the next generation of entrepreneurs to drive the African economy. Earlier on, we did catch up with some experts to find out more.
As we kick it off, of course, we're seeing a lot of trends happening in Africa and in the global market about job unemployment, job creation, and all of this. We know that for Africa to stand out, we're looking at 74 million jobs to be created by 2020. So far, we need about 52 more jobs that need to be created. Who is going to create this? Of course, the entrepreneurs. But now my question is, how do we change the mindset of the youth in Africa to look at entrepreneurship first other than employment? I think I'll start with the entrepreneur in the midst, Grace.
Thank you so much, Michael. When you talk about the issue of mindset change should not only be a burden of us, the young people, in terms of transforming the way we approach opportunities and therefore create entrepreneurship opportunities for ourselves. It should start with the education system itself. When I started high school, primary school, there was no way I was taught to think about creating jobs in my adult life. These are things we're now discussing and learning, trying to learn the ropes as we are adults now, coming together with the rest of the world. This is a topical issue. Sad enough, we had an education system that was created that failed to really see what the jobs of the future will require. And I'm glad we've started this conversation, but more importantly, mindset change should start with policy making. How do we frame and review the current education system in our countries, right from preschool to primary school to high school to college? There is a huge influx of graduates that are seeking employment, and I feel we are at a point where we can say we have a crisis and we need agency, we need speed we need to immediately act so that we address the challenge of unemployment. Mindset change when it comes to us entrepreneurs, for me, the key is industrialization. There is no other better answer. We need to start learning also how to industrialize in Africa. We have a lot of raw materials. Think about in agriculture, think about our mineral wealth, think about us as the people, the raw material, the human capital of Africa. How do we start seeing that as opportunities to create jobs, to monetize and develop our continent? So it's how I'm glad we're already starting these conversations. This is evidence of mindset change. We're seeing it, the need, we're addressing the need by constantly engaging in dialogue, but we need to constantly, immediately move to action.
Gentlemen, of course, Grace is bringing something on the table that is rather very interesting, something to do with the education system. I'll start with Lawrence, and I'll come back to you, Sharma, just 1 second. Do you see a need, an urgent need for Africa to actually revise the education system as a whole?
Thanks for the question. Thanks for having me here. I think that's a very critical question. Has been going on for quite a number of years, decades, if I must say. And I think the hugest challenge with the education system is that you've had teachers who are used to train students with a certain pedagogy and curriculum that has been known for over years. So when we start thinking about education and curriculum change, it's a holistic thing that needs to actually be looked at. If we don't start training teachers on new ways of teaching, on new ways of engaging students, then first of all, the people who are exchanging that, or rather sharing that knowledge with the future of the economy, which is the human resource capital of Africa, I think we are going to miss out. But then also, another complex thing with the education change is also, I mean, we can't wake up and just change curriculum and systems. As much as the urgent need is there, I think there needs to be a much more holistic look at what are the problems of the next 20, 30 years going to be. They're probably not going to be the same ones we're looking at and concerned about now. And that thinking about skilling tomorrow's economy is a fundamental one that would help us get to think about the social media disruption of the normal ways of doing business nowadays, the artificial intelligence, and things that are actually, shaping tomorrow's globalization. But I would say that while education change in of itself is good, it's better to then look at what we are educating our new generations for, looking at what the needs will be in the future. We are very much concentrating on now, and then that holistic approach is not being given to the actual, problems that will come in the future. So by the time we are getting to the future, we'll again be talking about, education change then. While if we thought about now, 50 years to come, and I'm glad, we have enough frameworks, the Agenda 2063, that we have a lot of policies and frameworks that exist, but then we're not embedding that within education, political, social, and cultural systems, which then shape the enabling environment to actually change attitudes, mindsets of the people that we're actually, training.
Lawrence, when you talk about changing the education system right now, brings me to a conversation that happened in Davos at the World Economic Forum, of course, where Jack Ma, who leads Alibaba Group, he mentioned that we need to change right now, and not just with the education system, but which kind of skills we're bringing to the market. And I want to draw my attention to Shamaki. Shamaki, we, of course, are definitely looking at China, of course, where Alibaba and a lot more other companies, big companies, tech companies are actually setting up shop right now. What do you see that Chinese actually did different to see growth on their small enterprises? Because if you talk China right now, they will tell you Apple is made in China, everything else is made in China.
No, thank you, and thanks for bringing me on this show, and I'm happy and honored to be here with my colleagues. And this has been a phenomenal exchange of ideas and young people the last few days. So I think to have this discussion in Kigali is certainly inspiring, and I think you've set the bar in terms of youth excellence and really having a conversation that's open, honest, and hope we can get into this with this panel. But to get to your question, I think it's an important question, and China has done a lot of things differently. I think China has been extremely ambitious with their their roadmap, the Silk Road ambition that they have in terms of investing in infrastructure. But the biggest investment that China made, and you're seeing the benefits of these results now, is 10, 20 years ago, where I think Africa should be thinking about and doing now, which is investment in young people to prepare them for jobs of the future. Now, yes, the education system is a challenge, and starting younger and making sure that our policies are holistic and cover the broad range of government, not just within education sector, but the entire national development plan. But one thing that I keep seeing consistently over and over again is when young people that transition between formal education, whether it's university, college, and getting into the labor market. And there are two key gaps that I often see is the huge skills mismatch, but also the soft and transferable skills. There are certain skills like budgeting you're never really taught in school. So when you enter a labor market and you have your first job, the relationship that young people have with money is different. It's new for the first time. They have huge amounts of money or not lack of money and don't know how to invest some of that capital. So the transferable skills that we need once young people graduate, the skills that they're not picking up in formal education, is a huge gap that I see. So investing in young people early age, investing, I think, in infrastructure, which Kigali, again, a good example of what they've done. I think in Africa, huge infrastructure investment could open up job opportunities for young people. And I see this as an opportunity, and I see the way to innovate this is through the tech sector. So you've made an argument for tech being a huge opportunity in China, but I think instead of talking about Silicon Valley, I think we need to change the narrative in Africa and talk about Silicon Savannah. And how do we change that mindset and bring these new ideas to bring tech sector to here? I think last year you had Jack Ma here, you had Mark Zuckerberg in Nairobi. Yeah, Akon was here last year as well. And I think the more exposure of tech companies from different parts of the world to places of Africa, and I think as seeing Africa as a meaningful and a labor force that is skilled. And I think that's the onus that should be on governments is how can you prepare your future leaders to make sure when big tech companies come here that you're offering them the right skills. I think one of the drawbacks of China's huge presence in Africa is that they're not employing enough Africans. That Africans who are in the labor force when China is here is often remedial or low-skilled jobs. They're not in the tech sector. So how can we really reinvest in the skill building? How can we reinvest in the soft and transferable skills when young people have the formal education to make a meaningful impact when they're in the labor market?
Definitely. Now, let's move on to Grace again. Allow me to take this next question to you. Of course, are you seeing enough tax breaks in your particular sector in the country where you're from that actually you would say is creating a little bit of a breathing space for entrepreneurs? And how can we actually harness this on the continent?
Our situation is slightly different. When you talk about Zimbabwe, we are a nation that is currently reviewing a lot of things. We're going through a transformative stage that could potentially see such incentives being given, especially to young entrepreneurs. The biggest challenge we've had so far is the economy was in dire stress. There were several impediments to the success of not only entrepreneurs, but even foreign investors were coming into the country. Recently, the new Minister of Finance made an announcement on and reviewed a couple of policies around tax, around the currency we use. We're a multi-currency state that was trying to reintroduce our own currency. So I would like to hold on and say, from my country, we would require a bit more time because most of those things are really under review. We haven't really been performing as expected of other economies around Africa. You look at the fact that we recently made reviews to the indigenization policy. That was a few months ago, and the whole world is excited. So in terms of tax breaks, I think it gives Zimbabwe a bit more time. We may see a bit more transformation that may be more favorable to us entrepreneurs, even foreign the businesses that are quite interested in coming into the country. Of course, change will take time. Change will take time. Everyone is holding their gut and trying to really project what may happen in the future, make one or two projections, but only time will tell. All we have right now is hope that there may be reviews that will be favorable, especially to the small to medium enterprises sector.
Your take on this, gentlemen?
I think I would very much agree with what Nicola is mentioning. I think the whole idea and aspiration, for Africa, we need to be a bit careful about ambition and delivery. And that's part of the backlog we've had with a myriad of policies and frameworks that then are not followed by the requisite human resourcing, the actual investment, the actual financing, and the diversification of the opportunities we have to valorize all the resources that we have. I mean, for me, I would say, I think, starting off, looking at, the intellectual pool of human resource capital we have, in terms of the rhetoric around the demographic bonus we have, the 70% being young people under the age of 29 and so on. I think we need to creatively think on how we actually, first of all, within national development plans, have youth-centric budgeting processes. And that means then allocating requisite resources from the public sector into actual, youth-targeted, inclusive development outcomes that then address the issues of young people. But then also on top of that, I think we've talked a lot about the private-public partnerships for a while, and there are examples that are quite exemplary, but I think it's high time we start looking at the philanthropists and venture capitalists and people who are within innovative financing mechanisms that then can tap into areas that the public sector would not necessarily invest in. And I think coming earlier actually to the question around mindsets, I think for me, we do have the creativity and the innovation within the frameworks that young people have and they're exposed to, as limited as they are. I think the cushioning of the risk of entering into entrepreneurship is something that is not really being addressed. So from legal redresses to actually just the returns on investments, the bureaucratic measures that young people have to go through to open a business, to run a business, to make. Young people won't get into business when they see all of this. So that enabling environment needs a bit more investment, time, and also just discussions with young people so that we contextualize what policies and plans are being made to create the environment better for them.
Maybe if I should take from what you just said and what Grace has just said. Grace mentioned that, of course, we need to see these reviews happening and a bit of a change or a shift in the paradigm, but it could take a lot more time than we expect, and we don't need to take a whole lot of time because we don't have that time. But let me jump to Shama. Shama, of course, we do know that the informal sector and entrepreneurs go hand in hand. Of course, if we're looking at economic development for Africa, we do know that SMEs create up to 70% of the jobs in the formal sector. The informal sector, of course, if you look at the likes of Rwanda, employing about 70% of the country, should we give enough tax breaks or even more breathing space for these to actualize? And we'll take a break after that.
I just want to pick up on Lawrence's.
All right, let's go.
Quickly. I think he raised something really important, and we talk about this now in terms of gender-sensitive budgeting, but also youth-sensitive budgeting, and it's important that we don't see these in isolation. So yes, they might sit in a certain department, they might sit in a certain ministry, but can we think about it as holistic and making sure that the entire government is quite serious about when we talk about gender and youth? Defense often in most countries is the biggest budget. Can we challenge governments to think outside the box and to say, as much investment as you're making in defense, can you also do that in gender and youth and make sure that that is equivalent? I think that would send quite a strong signal to encourage more young entrepreneurs, to encourage more young startups. But to get to your question around the informal sector, and I totally agree with you, one of the most unique things I think about Africa is how can we think outside the box in terms of creating incentives for the informal sector to be really a part of the formal sector and the formal society. So I totally agree with you. I think we need to think outside the box in terms of how we think of their participation. And the world is moving. Just some quick stats. So last year, in terms of crowdsourced funding alone in 2017, so pooling of resources and coming up with ideas, whether it's to innovate the informal sector or to pump more money into the informal sector. In the US alone, it's $3 billion, almost $3 billion in terms of crowdsourced funding. So when you look at the stats of huge crowdsourced funding platforms, the gap is in Africa. You look at stats and you find the stats in Asia, you find the stats in Middle East, you find the stats in North America, but there's a huge gap. You don't find stats in Africa. And I think this could be a huge platform and an opportunity for entrepreneurs, for many people in the informal sector. And you think of holistically, you think of old African proverbs, right? It takes a village to raise a child. And here's a village actually putting the resources and money towards generating the economy. And I think as Africans and I think as young people working on the continent, working globally, we need to think a bit more on using what I think is new power and the new way of participation or mass participation to also spark the informal sector or spark young entrepreneurship.
Moving on, experts say that a green economy will result in improved human well-being and social equity. While it will be significantly reducing environmental degradation, Concerns still remain on whether nations backing this frontier can really walk the talk. Let's kickstart this particular conversation, and of course we'll start from home. They always say east or west, home is best. This issue of going green, what do we mean when we say we want to go green as our economies are concerned, as far as the economies are concerned?
Okay, thank you so much. Green, yes, that's a good question, because sometimes when you say green, people expect trees around. And it's not just trees, it's not planting trees, it's green. Being green is it's a lifestyle. For anything that we do or we use, anything surrounding us can be greened if we want. It's just a matter of commitment and the will for people to do. Starting from our household, you can green your home. You can green your home starting, you can have your light saving bulbs that would cut off how much electricity you use. You are being green. You can cut on how much water you use, you consume at your household level. You are being green. You can, so many things that you can do. So it's part of our life. I call it a lifestyle.
It's a lifestyle.
It's a lifestyle.
It's a lifestyle. Victor, so from Nigeria, where you come from, how are the people back there getting plugged into this lifestyle of going green?
It's a process. It's a process. It's definitely one that has been on for a while. But I think what's the word to use? There's a huge momentum and a huge push towards it now, because people are slowly realizing without this, there may be no future. So essentially now people are trying to adapt a lifestyle at homes, at their businesses, thinking of little ways to start the contributions from them, be it your personal carbon footprint, so the carbon footprint of the companies you work for, or even the processes. Like, for example, you see some farms that are now trying to look into biogas, because essentially the waste coming from their crop, or let's say a poultry farm, the waste, you're not doing anything with it. It could be used as fertilizer. Some of those waste could go into biogas to then power your facility. And what are you doing then? You're saving cost and you're helping the environment. So people are slowly realizing that going green is the way forward to preserve the environment, and also there could be a financial aspect to it, whereas going green is not expensive. You could actually have cost savings by going green. So then even the people that may not be too big on environments, once they hear you can save me money at home in the office, it makes it easier.
Right. We'll interrogate that aspect of it not being expensive in the course of this conversation. But let me just jump into this, bring in Gaia on this, from where you come from. Talk to us a bit about whether we as environment specialists are the ones who are making it too complicated for ordinary people with as little background information on environmental matters to plug into this thing that Jeanette calls a lifestyle.
Sure. Well, I think it's all about whether there's opportunities to engage in that lifestyle. So I think often, well, at least in the United States, where I'm originally from, green is kind of everywhere. There's companies who have an entire industry and have a price markup to sell greener products. Seventh Generation is a great example of that. It was actually interesting, though, coming here. I've been here for 5 years, living in Rwanda for 5 years, and people are amazed that anybody would spend more money on their toilet paper because it was environmentally sustainable. And I think partially is that there doesn't really seem to be a market there yet for it, and that's partially just because maybe awareness is hasn't yet caught up. I will be honest and say I think it's a small segment of the population in the United States that really is willing to spend more money to be green. And so, but I think what you said is exactly right. There are opportunities where it can be cheaper, but I believe that there's other externalities at play from polluting the environment that are not priced into existing products that are unsustainable, and that will, I think, continue to hold back the process of greening.
And so that means we need to actually create awareness so that people can be able to see those opportunities that are available with going green. Hauta, in South Africa, talk to us a bit about what is going on back there as far as greening the South African economy is concerned.
There's quite a lot that is taking place. I agree with my co-panelists on the inputs they've made, but just to indicate that what is also important is the issue of circular economy, because it says in the greening process, you do reuse of material, recycling of material, you reduce waste that is going to landfill. It's about diverting waste from going to landfill, because in what you generally throw away, you reuse. In the process of reusing, there is job creation, there is enterprise or SMME development, and at the same time, there is big environmental benefit, which is about waste diversion from going to landfill, which is the greening aspect. But it goes beyond that in terms of circularity, because it says closed loop. Let's not have products or material going to waste, because waste is a resource. Let's keep it within the cycle. Let's keep it within the loop. Let's do something about waste.
I want to read your thoughts, first of all, Jeanette. Back here in Rwanda, what is actually the government doing? What is actually policymakers doing? And everybody involved trying to do so that this thing doesn't just sound like an alien to locals.
I think the government have been doing a lot in terms of facilitating or just including it. There have been so many policies that have been put in place. We have Green Growth and Climate Change Resilience Strategy, which actually is supposed to guide all sectors on how they can change the way they've been doing things, what they should be doing to green their sectors. So they're different. If you go to agriculture sector, specific things that they will do for greening or sustainable agriculture. If you go to the energy sector, so all sectors have been guided on how.
So the guidelines are there?
Yes.
But then, so how have those guidelines been lifted from those beautiful papers to actualization?
I would say it's a long journey, but I think we are getting there. If we compare, I'm talking from the REMA perspective, part of the REMA responsibility is to mainstream or to help other sectors integrate environment and climate change to their own plan strategies. And it's been going on so many years ago. And if I compare where they started and where they are now, I would say a good job is being done. Because when it started, some sectors would think it would be an additional budget for them to green their sector or to integrate environment and climate change to their strategies. But this time, they've realized that it's actually not additional budget. It's just changing the way they've been doing things. For example, if the government have been promoting the energy, there are so many opportunities. It's not just bringing in the fossil fuel energy. We have opportunities in the solar energy, for example. And the government been promoting even private sector to invest in the solar energy. And maybe later on, after some researchers, will even enter into the geothermal energy. Those are green energy sources that we have and opportunities we have. So it's just a matter of looking at what you've been doing and see where it's been wrong and try to change. So that's why when I started, I said it's a matter of, at household level, it's a lifestyle. It's a lifestyle. It's just changing your lifestyle. So even from the government perspective, it's changing. We always tell our stakeholders that because we usually have different workshops and trainings with them, that we are not telling you to just come up with different things. It's just you to change how you've been doing things. For example, if you're going to construct a road, just make sure the road you're going to construct, for it to be sustainable enough. Sustainable means for it to stay for longer, not just investing how many billions in the road and then after 5 months when it rains,
it's not there.
The water rushes out the whole road. You just have to maintain, where am I going to have the water? Where will the water pass? Can I plant trees on the road, at least even to capture the carbon from the emissions, the car emissions that will be passing on that road? So it's a normal thing, and planting trees is not something that you would need a big investment. I think it's something that anyone can do.
Anyone can do.
Yeah.
So Jeanette, I want to put you on the spot a bit. Allow me to do so. I don't know if you will, but it's a difficult one.
Yes.
You've really responded really well on what the government is doing to actually ensure that this greening of our economies is actually sustainable and achievable.
Yes.
What is the government not doing?
I would say that I think in the past, the involvement of private sector was not that much or visible, if I may call it that way. Probably the government thought, when the issue comes, it's like when you have a home, an issue comes, as a head of the home, you feel like it's your responsibility to act quickly. Yeah. So the private sector was not involved that much, but now we've realized that without private sector involvement, it will not be achievable. So we're trying to see how private sector can be involved.
Right. Fair enough. Let's get to Victor here. Victor, same question. What is actually being done back in Nigeria, and also by you as a young entrepreneur yourself, to actually support in this endeavor of greening the economy of Nigeria, for instance?
So let me start from the government side, because that's a little bit. I only have a little bit of information, being private sector and all. Yes. From the government, there are policies in place, and they're trying to enforce, like the extended producer's responsibility, which essentially also ties in with the circular economy. It's a way to get producers to pay a small levy for, in this case, electronic waste, for the electronic devices or equipment that they bring into the country. And why is that? So basically, that levy can be used to support different e-waste recyclers in the country, because that way there's more motivation for them to actually go for it, because it could be an expensive process. For my company, I work with Sunray Ventures, a German-Nigerian venture. We're a venture builder, and we set up companies with sustainability at the core. So it's basically a green company. So we think of ideas and we look for companies that meet our tripod. Three main things, essentially. Number one, it needs to be, it has to have significant environmental impact. Number two, socioeconomic impact, so creation of jobs, improving the livelihood of people, being able to train the upcoming youth and everyone. And number three, economic returns, because it's still a company at the end of the day. So we try to think of ideas or companies that meet our tripod, and then we set companies up and run them. To date, we have two main flagship companies. There's Daystar Power and Green Compass Recycling. But my focus now will be on Daystar Power, which has made the most progress so far, which is a solar company, renewable energy. In this case, what do we try to do for greening our economy? In Nigeria, we have, I think the amount spent for power generation by generators is about 14 billion naira. No, 14 billion US dollars, pardon my mistake. Essentially, we have identified that our economy cannot be built on the back of diesel and petrol generators. Sure. So essentially, what we try to do, we have small and mid-sized solar hybrid solutions that we provide to commercial clients, and now in some rural areas as well. And what are we trying to do? Essentially, we're trying to reduce carbon emissions. We're trying to increase profitability of these companies. If you have an SME or a micro SME, a huge cost for them is power. And with having to rely on these generators, it makes it harder for them. It's harder for the economy to thrive. And now, so let me give you a good example with the banking industry. A typical bank, let's say they consume about 15,000 to 25,000 liters of diesel every year. That's a lot. With our solutions, we're able to eliminate that. So basically, that equates to about 50 tons of CO2 in a year. And think of Nigeria, where you have about 6,000 to 8,000 banking branches and up to 10,000 ATMs. So we're looking at, with this type of systems, you can potentially save over 250,000 tons of carbon emissions every year.
Well, that's a wrap on some of our highlights for 2018. Until next time, from myself and the team, it's goodbye.